When I made my first video on Wuthering Waves, I was not really asking whether the game was good. I was asking something more specific. Would it fix the problems that almost held its story back? Because at the time, we were coming out of a climax I liked overall, but one that left me with a few very real worries. Some characters felt like they arrived too late, some emotional beats felt rushed, and some parts of the finale felt like the story was trying to make everyone mad at once without always knowing how to do that naturally. So when Lahai-Roi started, that was the question sitting in the back of my mind. Was that just one uneven ending, or was it a sign of a bigger structural problem? Now the region is over. We have seen the main conflict, we have seen the payoff, we have seen the epilogue. And looking back, the most interesting part is not just whether Lahai-Roi was good. It is how differently Wuthering Waves handled the exact things I was worried about when this channel started. So today I want to look back at that journey, not as a simple region review, but as the answer to a question I accidentally started asking in my very first video. The first thing I was worried about back then was character introduction, or more specifically, what happens when a story introduces someone important way too late. And looking back at my first video, I still agree with the core concern. Would I explain it in the same way now? Probably not, hopefully not. I like to believe there has been some growth here. But the worry itself was not wrong. The issue with Galbrina was never that she was a bad character. She was not. The issue was where the story placed her. She arrived right near the climax of a major arc, and that immediately created an awkward problem. The story needed her to matter, a lot. She clearly was not just a small supporting character who showed up, said something mysterious and vanished into the plot fog. She needed presence, she needed relevance, she needed enough focus for the audience to understand why she mattered. But this was still the climax. This was supposed to be the payoff for everything the region had already built. The protagonist, the existing cast, the conflict, the emotional weight of the arc, all of that still needed room. So Galbrina ended up caught between two competing needs. The story had to introduce her properly, but it also had to finish the arc properly. And once those two things started fighting for space, the pacing began to feel compressed. Not because every scene was bad, some of it was still cool, some of it was still cinematic, but structurally, it felt like the game was asking us to care about a new major character while also asking us to emotionally process the end of an entire region. That is a lot to put on one climax, probably too much, and this is one of the easiest traps for gacha stories to fall into. A new character arrives, the banner needs them to matter, the story needs them to feel important immediately, but the larger narrative already has momentum. Sometimes those things line up naturally, sometimes they do not. When they do not, you can feel the machinery behind the story. The character stops feeling like they arrived because the plot naturally made room for them. They start feeling like they arrived because the schedule did, and that was one of my worries going into Lahai-Roi. Was Wuthering Waves going to keep running into that problem? Would every major region eventually reach a point where new characters had to be pushed into the ending? Would the climax always need to bend around whoever had to matter next? At the time, I did not know. Now that Lahai-Roi is over, I think the answer is much clearer. Because Lahai-Roi handled its important characters very differently. The region did not wait until the final hour to make people matter. Emmett is the obvious example. She did not become important because the finale suddenly needed an emotional center. Her role was built over time. Her bond with Rover had space to grow. Her ideals had space to form. Her desire to become a savior did not appear because the plot needed one big tragic button to press. It was part of who she was. So when the story finally reached the biggest emotional moments around her, they felt earned. Not shocking exactly, the game was clearly building towards saving her. But emotional payoff does not always need surprise, sometimes it just needs weight. And Emmett had weight because the story gave her time. That same idea shows up across the rest of Lahai-Roi, just in quicker, different ways. Yuki was not just thrown in as the new saver archetype of the patch, her story explored what saving people actually means, especially through her view of Rover and the burden she chose to carry. Denia did not feel like a random character episode sitting beside the main plot. Her story connected personal tragedy back to the grand architect, the fractious, and the larger conflict. Lucilla worked almost in the opposite direction. Her segue was quieter, more reflective, and less about a massive battle. But through her, the Rebel College became more than a location, the students became more than background NPCs, and Lahai-Roi got something live service regions do not always get, an emotional afterlife. That is where the contrast really clicked for me. Lahai-Roi did not make its important characters matter by forcing them all into one giant climactic moment. It gave them different kinds of importance. Emmett carried the emotional heart, Hyuki explored the burden of being a savior, Denia connected personal suffering to the larger antagonistic conflict, Lucilla gave the region its epilogue, the students made the Rebel College feel alive, nobody had to fight for the exact same space, and that makes a huge difference. In 2.7, Galbrena felt like she had to become important very quickly, right when the story was already trying to conclude everything else. In Lahai-Roi, importance was spread across the journey. Some characters mattered at the beginning, some in the middle, some at the climax, some after the climax was already over. That is probably why this region feels so much more natural. Not perfect, there are still characters I wish had gotten more time, there are still threads that could have been stronger, but compared to the concern I had when this channel started, this is a massive improvement. Wuthering Waves did not just introduce more characters, it learned how to make them belong, and once that clicked for me, the next comparison became even more interesting. Because the second problem I had back then was not only about the new character, it was about what the story seemed to do to Rover in order to make that character matter. The second worry I had back then was a little more complicated. It wasn't just about Galbrena, it was about what the story seemed to do to Rover because of her. And this is where I think my old video had the right instinct, even if I would frame the argument differently now. The basic feeling was this: in order to make Galbrena important, the story had to push Rover into a weaker position than usual. Not weaker in the sense that Rover can never struggle, that would be boring. A protagonist who never struggles is not compelling. The problem was the way that struggle was framed. Up until that point, Rover had been built as someone with unusual resistance, unusual experience, and a very specific kind of narrative weight. So when the story placed them inside that illusion and had them collapse in a way that felt a little too convenient, it created a strange reaction. At least for me. I understand what the scene was trying to do, show Rover's fear, their vulnerability, show that even someone like them can be shaken by the possibility of losing people. That idea is not bad, actually, it could have been amazing, but it did not feel like the story was naturally exploring Rover's weakness. It felt like the story needed Rover weakened so Galbrena could step into the center. That is a very different feeling. One is character writing, the other is story mechanics wearing a very emotional hat and hoping nobody notices. And once you feel that, the climax starts looking messy in a very specific way. The story wants Galbrena to matter, it wants the cast to matter, it wants the moment to feel huge, but Rover, who should be one of Wuthering Waves' strongest anchors, suddenly feels less like the center of the climax and more like a piece being adjusted so the structure can work. That was the part that worried me. So going into Lahai-Roi, this became one of my biggest questions. Could Wuthering Waves keep Rover central without making everyone else feel irrelevant? That balance is difficult. If the protagonist matters too much, the cast starts feeling decorative. If the cast matters too much, the protagonist starts feeling like a witness. Lahai-Roi needed a better answer, and I think it found one. The key difference is that Lahai-Roi does not make Rover important by making everyone else smaller. It also does not make everyone else important by weakening Rover. It lets each side matter in a different way. Look at Amed's conflict. Rover is absolutely central there. The emotional core of that story does not work without them. Amed's admiration for Rover matters. Her desire to become a savior matters because of what Rover represents to her. Her sacrifice hits harder because she is not just trying to save people in some abstract heroic way. She is trying to become the kind of person Rover made her believe she could be. But Amed does not become meaningful by making Rover helpless, and Rover does not become meaningful by making Amed smaller. Their importance comes from the relationship, from what they reveal in each other, from the way their choices complete the emotional shape of that conflict. That is already a much cleaner structure. Then the finale goes even further. When everyone comes together, it does not feel like the story is desperately trying to prove that every playable character deserves screen time. It feels like the natural result of the region's journey. The people of Lahai-Roi matter because the story had already shown us why they matter. They are connected to the region, to its ideals, to its failures, and to the emotional cost of everything that happened. So when the region comes together, it does not feel like a checklist, it feels like a response. That is the word I kept coming back to. Response. In 2.7, the everyone comes together feeling sometimes felt like the story assembling pieces for scale. In Lahai-Roi, it felt like the world answering Rover's effort. That is a very different kind of payoff, and why the line about this is not being a story where heroes save the world, but a story where the world saves its heroes works so well. It does not take anything away from Rover. If anything, it makes Rover more meaningful. Rover matters so much that the world responds to them. Ahmed matters. Hiyuki matters. Sigrika matters. The students matter. The people lost to the void matter. The ordinary people matter. The region itself matters. But none of that pushes Rover out of the story. It surrounds them. It gives their role more weight instead of less. That is the thing Lahai-Roi understood much better. You do not have to weaken the protagonist to put the cast into the spotlight. You have to give the cast things only they can provide. Rover can be the emotional anchor. Ahmed can be the heart. Hiyuki can challenge what it means to be a savior. The people of Lahai-Roi can turn an impossible rescue into something larger than one person's strength. Lucilla can later give the region its reflective ending. Tenya can connect personal tragedy back to the central antagonistic conflict. Everyone matters, but not in the same way. That is why it works. The story is not forcing every character into the same role. It lets them occupy different parts of the emotional structure, and Rover sits at the center of that without needing to absorb everything. That is such an important evolution for Wuthering Waves. For a long time, one important question was if Rover actually felt like the protagonist. But Lahai-Roi shows something even better. Rover can be the protagonist of a story that still belongs to many people. That is the balance 2.7 struggled with. At least for me. It tried to make the climax bigger by pulling everyone into the same space. Lahai-Roi made the story bigger by letting everyone's role connect naturally. No sudden spotlight theft, no forced weakening, no feeling that the protagonist had to be pushed down so someone else could rise. Just a region where the hero mattered, the cast mattered, and the emotional payoff came from how those things supported each other. That is why this comparison feels so interesting to me now. The concern I had back then was not completely wrong. Wuthering Waves did have a structural problem it needed to solve, but Lahai-Roi did not avoid that problem by going smaller. It solved it by becoming more careful, more patient, more aware of what each character actually needed to contribute. And once the story figured that out, the whole region started flowing in a way Wuthering Waves had not fully achieved before, which is where the real retrospective begins. This is where the biggest difference starts showing. When I look back at Lahai-Roi now, the thing that stands out most is not one single moment. It is the flow, the way the region begins, the way the conflict grows, the way the characters are introduced, the way the main emotional payoff lands, and, maybe most importantly, the way the story does not immediately run away after the biggest conclusion is over. That last part matters a lot. A lot of gacha stories treat the climax like the finish line. The big battle happens, the emotional music plays, someone says something dramatic. Maybe the villain smiles and says this was all part of the plan, because apparently villains in gacha games are legally required to do that at least once per region. Then the story moves on. New patch, new region, new characters, new emotional damage. Very efficient. But efficiency is not the same thing as closure. That is one of the biggest lessons Lahai-Roi learned. The region does not end the moment the main conflict reaches its biggest cinematic payoff. It keeps breathing afterward. We get time to sit with what happened. We get time to see what remains. We get time to understand what Lahai-Roi actually meant beyond the crisis that threatened it. This is where the segues become so important. Lucilla's story could have been just a smaller character-focused chapter after the main event, a quieter spotlight before the game moves on, and sure, it is that, but the more I sat with it, the less it felt like only Lucilla's story. It felt like Lahai-Roi's epilogue. Through her, the story returns to the Rebel College, the students, and the question of what this place becomes after its original purpose changes. Not just, did we win, but what happens to everyone who still has to live here? That is the kind of question that makes a region feel like more than a stage. The Rebel College is not just background anymore. The students are not just NPCs standing around, so the world looks populated. They have fears, pride, attachment. They understand the risks of the path they are choosing, and they choose it anyway. That gives Lahai-Roi texture. It makes the region feel like something people believe in, not just something the plot needed us to visit. Then Denia's story pulls into the opposite direction. Lucilla gives Lahai-Roi closure. Denia keeps the larger conflict open. Her story connects the region back to the Grand Architect, the Fractious, and the kind of damage that does not disappear just because one region's main crisis has ended. So Lahai-Roi does not feel sealed off, it feels connected, finished emotionally, but still relevant to the larger story. That balance is what makes the region feel so much stronger in hindsight. The main conflict did not have to do everything, the climax did not have to introduce every important idea, the protagonist did not have to solve every problem alone, the side stories did not feel detached, and the epilogue did not feel like extra content. It felt like the final emotional sentence of the region. That is the part I kept coming back to. Lahai-Roi had shape, build-up, escalation, payoff, aftermath, closure, future consequences. And when a live service story manages to do that across multiple patches, that is not a small thing. Especially in gacha games where the story always has to balance characters, banners, updates, regions, player expectations, and whatever new emotional crisis the writers decided to cook this month. But Lahai-Roi shows that Wuthering Waves can actually make that structure work, not just by ignoring the gacha format, not by pretending the character rotation does not exist, but by giving the story enough patience that the format does not swallow it. And that is the real answer to the question I had in my first video. Back then I was worried that Wuthering Waves might keep running into the same structural problems. Characters arriving too late, climaxes trying to do too much, the protagonist being bent out of shape to make other people matter, regions ending before they had time to feel complete. Lahai-Roi does not erase those concerns forever. One good region does not mean the problem can never come back, but it does show something important. Wuthering Waves can learn, it can adjust, it can take the kind of story that felt slightly forced before and make it feel much more natural. And that is probably why this region means so much to me now, not just as a player, but as someone who started this channel by wondering whether the game could improve. Because now, looking back at the full Lahai-Roi journey, I do not feel like I'm asking that question anymore, at least not in the same way. The answer is already there, not perfect, not final, but definitely there. But that's just what I think. Did Lahai-Roi feel like a major step forward for Wuthering Waves' storytelling for you? Do you think the region handled its characters and protagonists better than previous arcs? And now that Lahai-Roi is over, what do you think the next region needs to prove? Let me know down in the comments. Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more stories discussions like this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.